Shalom, shalom. Back into the Origins of the American Indians by Lee Huddleston. Chapter 2. We're just going to read the Acostan tradition. For now, at least. Acostan Garcia, 1589 through 1607. Joseph de Acosta, the Acostan tradition. Europeans made surprisingly little headway before 1589 in their attempts to discover the origins of the American Indians. The usual method for tracing origins consisted of noting certain cultural affinities, dress, speech, manner, religion between the Americas and some Old World people of antiquity, and the inventing of a mode of transporting that people to America. Infrequently, the comparisons might be made with contemporary peoples to the extent of noting that the explanation or the explaining of the differences which had developed since the settlement of the New World on the whole. The writers presumed a large measure of cultural stability that is implicit in their works was a belief of cultures of antiquity had not changed much in the intervening millennia. Joseph de Acosta changed that pattern. Acosta went to Peru as a Jesuit missionary in 1570. He achieved significant importance to be included in Viceroy Toledo's train in his trip through Charcas, and in his war against the Chiriguanos of Chaco. He probably knew Pedro Sarmiento de Gamboa, Toledo's admiral. Acosta spent 17 years in the Indies, most of them in Peru. In 1586, he went to Mexico, where he met Juan de Tovar and made extensive notes on Tovar's history of the Mexican Indians. The following year, he returned to Spain. Acosta began to write his own history of the New World around 1580. He completed the first two books by 1584. On his return, they were published in Latin. Oh, I skipped a line here. On his return to Spain, he set about preparing them for publication. In 1589, they were published in Latin at Salamanca. Acosta then translated them into Spanish and published them as the first quarter of his great Historia Natural y Moral de las Indias. A second edition followed in 1591 and a third in 1608. Edward Grimston's English translation appeared in 1604. Joseph de Acosta, writing almost 100 years after Columbus's discovery, was the first to approach the problem involved in getting the Indians to America and tracing their origins in a truly objective fashion. Acosta maintained that experience was far more reliable than philosophy, and that it could reveal more than any reason or philosophic demonstration. It was lack of experience which led the ancients to deny the existence of antipodes. Modern experience had proved that there were antipodes and they could be reached and that the tropics were habitable. And since experience had proven men did indeed live in America, and since all men must have descended from Adam, they must of necessity have come from Europe, Africa, or Asia. Rather than jump into cultural comparisons to find the Old World counterpart for the Indians, Acosta decided that he should first examine the situation of America with respect to the Old World, both geographically and historically, to discover how men could have got to the New World. Only then could he determine which men had actually came. Acosta had already expressed his disdain for those who argued that the name Peru derived from Ophir, or Yucatan from Jactan, or the Inca names Tito or Palo from Titus or Paul. Word comparisons, he maintained, were too weak as arguments to sustain such grand conclusions. How could the first men have came to America? It seemed unlikely to Acosta that there was a second ark to carry them, nor could he credit an angel with that work. Furthermore, he said, I am not convinced that the first Indians came to this world as a result of purposeful navigation, nor do I wish to concede that the ancients had developed the art of navigation whereby men this day pass from place to place on the ocean with certainty, nor do I find evidence of so notable a voyage in all antiquity. So far as Acosta could determine, the ancients had no lodestone or compass and could not, therefore, have made the voyage across the Atlantic. Or what of accidental discovery by being blown off course and to the Indies? It seems to me quite likely that in times past men came to the Indies driven unwillingly by the wind. Acosta answered, but he did not think this an adequate explanation of the American population. The reason which forces me to say that the first men of these Indies came from Europe or Asia is so as not to contradict the Holy Scriptures, which clearly teaches that all men descended from Adam, and thus we can give no other origin to man in the Indies. By the same token, the beasts of the New World, as well as its men, must be derived from the Old World. For does not the Bible say that only those in the ark were saved? Was it reasonable to think that settlers who came to America, either intentionally or because of storm, though they might have women with them, also have wolves, tigers, and other ravenous beasts on the ship? It was more than enough for men to escape with their lives, driven against their will by the tempest, without carrying foxes and wolves and feeding them at sea. Since the beast could not have swum the ocean broad, and since they probably did not come in ships with men even for sport, and since a separate ark or angelic aid were implausible, how did they get to America? And would not a passage usable by beasts be usable by man also? Acosta forced by these considerations to conjecture that the New World we call the Indies was not completely divided and separate from the other world, and in the undiscovered north or south, the two worlds had a land connection. At worst, he concluded they were separated by only a narrow strait, such as that of Magellan, which could be crossed by man and beast easily. Acosta now had his ground rules, but he still did not have his Indians. Before giving his own opinion, he commented on those theories he had already heard. He contemptuously dismissed the Atlantis origin theory, saying that only children and old women could believe what Plato wrote of that island. Acosta was equally disdainful of the supposed Jewish origin of the Indians. True, both Indians and Jews were fearful, submissive, and ceremonious, and deceitful, but the Hebrews possessed writing and the Indians did not. The Hebrews also loved silver, but the Indians did not. The Hebrews practiced circumcision, but Acosta knew of no Indians who did. He did not credit the reports from the Yucatan. Furthermore, the Jews jealously preserved their heritage wherever they went, and Ezra specifically stated that they went to Arsarith to keep their laws. But if the Indians were Jewish, then they had forgotten their lineage, their law, their ceremonies, their messiahs, and their entire Judaism. It was difficult to discover the origins of the Americans because they had no written traditions. Acosta thought, however, the Indians came to the New World little by little, and they came by land or across a narrow strait. The major cause for their coming was nearness of the continents and in some undiscovered area. The first to have come a few thousand years ago would have been savage hunters driven by hunger or loss of homeland or overpopulation. These people settled down and retained little of their former culture. They developed their own civil institutions which were not beastly or sin razon, but worthy of respect. That was as far as Acosta could go, for it would be a rash and presumptuous to attempt to determine the precise origins of the Indians. Acosta returned to the matter of the Indian origins from time to time in the remainder of his Historia. He spoke of freeing the Indians from the belief that they had originated in the New World. Later, the question of corn arose. Whence came maize to the Indians, and why is this grain called Turkish grain in Italy, is sooner asked than answered. Actually, I found no evidence of this grain in antiquity. God eventually gave each area of the world what it needed: wheat to the old world and corn to the new. Also, neither the plants somehow survived the flood, or God made them anew afterward. They did not have to migrate. Acosta also returned to the problem of the animals in the New World to explain the beasts particular to America: the llama, the vicuna, alpaca, etc. Acosta did not think this fact greatly important. America was not the only section of the world with unique fauna. Acosta's arguments had a far-reaching importance. He was the first writer to attempt with the careful analysis of the conditions which must be met before any origin for the Indians could be determined. He was not the first to postulate a land bridge connecting the two worlds. That was integral to Sarmiento de Gamboa's Atlantis theory, but he was the first to propose a land connection or near connection which did not derive from some European legend. Acosta thought such a thing necessary to explain how such masses of animals and men could get to America. Sarmiento utilized a disappearing land bridge which was itself the homeland of the Indians, whose inundation hid the Indians from Europe. Acosta postulated a continuing connection which induced men to come to America because it was there. The geographical remoteness of the bridge and the low cultural level of the migrants were responsible for Europe's lack of knowledge of the New World. Acosta implied that America was settled as a natural consequence of its existence and the gradual expansion of primitive peoples. The only areas where such a connection could exist lay in the far south or in the far north. Tierra de Fuego might connect with the East Indies by a southern continent, or in the north, Greenland might connect with America, or Northeast Asia and America might be joined in the region of Anian, a kingdom and strait presumed to lie in the Alaska-Siberian region. Acosta's arguments constitute a denial of the utility of the 16th century methodology if, as he claimed, the first inhabitants were primitive hunters who settled America, became an agricultural people, and then developed their own civil customs, then it would be impossible to trace the origin or the original Indians by traditional method of comparing cultural traits. The cultural characteristics present in the modern Indian civilizations could not be the ones that they brought with them. Similarities between old and new world peoples and civilizations could not be indicative of origin. Presumably, the Indian cultures could be influenced by later arrivals. Even Acosta admitted the probability that the migration to America continued over a long period and that there may have been some transatlantic contact. The question of the origins of the Indians had long since ceased to have any substantial practical importance. The enslavement of the Indians and their forced labor, long permitted a practice as now argued almost entirely on legal and religious level. The judicial activities of viceroys Toledo in the 1570s and the legal beliefs of Pablo de Ondegardo and Juan Matienzo were concerned with the legal and religious circumstances under which an Indian could be forced to work. The nature of the Indians, or whether they descended from Atlantis, the 10 lost tribes of Israel, Solomon's sailors, or shipwrecked Europeans, they had come into intriguing intellectual problem. A matter of curiosity, but of no greater importance. Only on a few occasions in the future would the question of the Indian origins become of vital importance, and then only to certain particular racial, religious, or occult groups. Acosta's great attempt to establish ground rules for an intellectual dispute was of lasting importance. Few writers after 1590 were unaware of his Historia Natural y Moral de las Indias. Some ignored it and its arguments, and some tried to refute it. The logical completeness of his argument was its limitation. The question of Indian origins was an integral one. Acosta, in arguing that the old approaches were invalid, could not discover any new criteria by which the subject could be studied, unless or until such new criteria were found. The cultural autochthony aspect of Acosta's arguments must be accepted, in which case the debate must be discontinued or rejected in favor of continuing the old investigative procedures. The continued employment of the cultural comparison techniques indicates a general rejection of the cultural independence of the American Aborigines and a continuing inability to find or even to seek eagerly new ways of investigating such problems. This should not cause surprise. The application of archaeology to the study of ancient peoples had not begun. Archaeology was not used in America until late 18th century. Furthermore, the union of archaeology with comparative autonomy and ethnology to produce a scientific study of early man did not come about until the 19th century. For the most part, the men of the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries conceived the problem of human diffusion in geographical, historic, ethnological, and theological terms. The age did not recognize that the problem of the Indian origins might have two distinct aspects. The idea that the Indians might have different biological and cultural diversions was inherent in Acosta's concept of cultural independence for the Indians, but he did not develop significantly the idea of independence. The possibility of separate tribal and cultural origins would have little meaning to the men of the 16th or 17th century. Their theology did not allow enough time or diversity for such an idea. 17 years between Acosta's Historia Natural y Moral de las Indias and the publication of Gregorio Garcia's Origen de los Indios in 1607 was marked by the presence of an enormous amount of material on the New World. Most writers did not discuss the origin of the natives of America, but their testimony about the customs and the nature of the Indians was widely used by those who were interested in the question. Many of the more important descriptive works were available only in manuscript. Martín de Morua's Origen de los Reyes del Gran Reino del Perú was published in 1911. The same authors, Relación Geográfico Estudística del Perú, appeared first in 1925. The Historia Estelática Indiana of the Franciscan Jerónimo de Mendieta was not published until 1870, but it was used extensively by Juan de Tormentada in the early 17th century. Reginaldo de Lesgarra, his Descripción de las Indias, published in 1907, also added to the growing literature on the Indies. Published works which greatly increased knowledge of American and of America. I'm going to start that paragraph over. I'm getting all tongue twisted. Published works which greatly increased knowledge of America and contributed indirectly to the expansion of the interest in the origin question appeared frequently. Giovanni Boltero's fourth volume, Le Relazioni Universali, went through Italian editions of 1591, 1592, 1593, 1596, and 1599. A Spanish translation came out in 1599. Latin versions appeared in 1596 and 1598, and the English editions were published in 1601, 1611, and 1630. The material on America filled Philos 134 or I-34 through 182 of part 1 in the Valladolid edition of 1599. This part was not included in the two Latin editions. Considerable information was also provided by Bernardo de Vargas Machuca in his two anti-Las Casas books, Apologéticas y Discursos de la Conquista Occidentales and the Meliquia y Descripción de las Indias. Both commented extensively on the Indians. Vargas Machuca was almost wholly unfavorable towards the Las Casas school of thought about the nature of the Indians. In addition to English translations of Botero, Acosta, and Aliguera, the English readers interested in America had the massive implication of the principle of navigations, voyages, traffics, and discoveries of the English nation by Richard Hakluyt, published first in 1589 and in revised form in 1598 through 1600. French readers had the various editions of translations of Spanish works. They also had the fantastic accounts of André Thablet's I'm not reading that French stuff. It's the same words as all that Spanish that we just read. So, both published and unpublished materials from this period evidenced a continued and growing disillusionment with classical authority. One of the bitterest criticisms was Peter Albinus's pamphlet, A Treatise on Foreign Languages and Unknown Islands, which appeared near the end of the 16th century in Latin. Albinus denounced the ancients. What, pray, can be found more ridiculous than such men? What in the name of heaven moved them when they had explored almost no portion of the world in which they were placed to dream that they were other worlds where they could not penetrate? After pondering that for a few passages, Albinus concluded that experience and mistress of everything has refuted the false assertions of all of them. Spaniards too, not usually thought to be in tune with the developing rationalism of the late 16th and early 17th centuries, pondered the errors of the ancients. Indeed, they had been curious about those errors for generations. Generally speaking, Spaniards were not so critical as Albinus. Acosta was doubtless atypical, and the most prevalent critique was exemplified by the Primera parte de los problemas y secretos marvelosos de las Indias, published by the Mexican Médico Juan de Cardenas in 1591. Cardenas was not content to say the ancients had erred. He wanted to know why they had erred. The ancients had thought the burning zone uninhabitable, and the strictest philosophy it should be. And in the strictest philosophy it should be. Why were the tropics inhabitable? Cardenas found the answer in the cooling effect of the great variety of altitudes, in the summer rains, and the equal lengths of days and nights. Although the tropics and America were habitable, Cardenas thought the honor of the ancients was partly saved by virtue of the fact that the climate of the Indies had a degenerative effect on man, that people born in the New World did not live as long as Europeans, and that even Spaniards born in the Indies were more delicate than those born in Spain. The influence of Joseph de Acosta on the literature of Indian origins in the period of 1590 through 1607 was apparent. Though the literature retained much of its pre-Acostan flavor, the Carthaginian theory revived some support in Agustin Davila Padilla's Historia de la Función y Discurso de la Providencia de Santiago de México y de la Orden de Predicadores. Davila made a brief comparison of the Carthaginian and the Indian sacrificial practices, but he did not commit himself to the theory. Antonio de Herrera y Tordesillas, writing around 1600 in his Historia General de los Hechos de los Castellanos y las Indias y Tierra Firme del Mar Océano, completed and published in 1613, Part 1 issued in Madrid in 1601, also referred to Aristotle's version of the Carthaginian legend. Herrera pointed out that Aristotle had said the island was found and left uninhabited. The Carthaginian tale was given by Florian de Ocampo, who concluded that Hanno tradition, or Hanno tradition, however you want to pronounce that, found full support in Father Lizegarra's descripción. The Atlantis possibility received little commitment. Lizgarra, Herrera, and Enrico Martin in his Reportito of 1606 all rejected its intangibility, or untenable. It all rejected it as untenable. The other writers ignored it. This theory was the most frequently accepted possibility before 1580 seems to have lost most of its support by 1600. Similarly, no version of the Ophirian story got any support. The Jesuit Año Ovila, in his Historia del Reino y Providencias de Perú, quoted Acosta in the effect that the name Peru was derived from the name of a river. Herrera also referred to the supposed derivation of Peru from Ophir, but rejected this argument. Two writers of the period, Mendieta y Hakluyt, contributed new theories of Indian origins. Two others, Herrera y Enrico Martin, offered theories based largely on Acosta's arguments. Mendieta, who worked in Mexico, wrote only briefly about the origins of the Indians. He referred to the practice of circumcision among the certain Indians of Mexico, but he did not commit himself to a Jewish connection. Actually, he attributed the theories he did explain to other men to Father Almos. He attributed the option that the Indians came from one of three places at one of three times: from Babylonia, when the diversion of the tongues occurred, or later from the land of Sichem in the time of Jacob, when some fled from that land, or when the Israelites displaced the Canaanites, Amorites, and Jebusites. To some unspeculated or unspecified others, he attributed theories of Indian origins based on the stories of the captivity and the dispersion of the Jews. And in the flight of the Jews when Rome destroyed Jerusalem in the time of Vespucian. But as for himself, because there was no reason or foundation for any of these options which could affirm one more than the other, it is better to leave it undecided and let each take the one which best suits him. Hakluyt's contribution to the origin literature consisted of publishing a section from a manuscript by the Welshman David Powell relating to the pre-Columbian discovery of America by the Welsh prince Madoc. Hakluyt thought the story a true one. In brief, it told of the flight of Madoc to escape the civil wars of Wales. He and his followers sailed to the west, where they settled, presumably in America. Hakluyt did not think this was the earliest settlement of America, but men from the British Isles did contribute themselves, their culture and their language to the population of parts of America. Antonio de Herrera's Historia General de los Hechos y los Castellanos was a massive work, the latest editions to run 17 volumes. 10 volumes. The latest editions run to 17 volumes and 10 volumes. And John Stevens' English translation was 6 volumes. Herrera was the official historian of Spain and the Indies, and access to unpublished works as well as published materials. He concluded virtually all the commentators on the Indian origins, including the works of men as Motalina, Fernando Colón, y Las Casas, not then available in published Spanish editions. Acosta made the greatest impact on Herrera. His arguments concerning the origins of the Americans paralleled Acosta's rather closely. He rejected a second Noah's Ark and intentional voyages to America. He denied that the ancients knew of the lodgestone or compass, or that they knew about much about sailing. His conclusions were largely Acosta's. That which would reveal the most about the origins of the Indians was the proximity of America to parts of the Old World, but Europe's geographical knowledge was too scanty to affirm anything in that respect. Herrera did not follow Acosta so far as to affirm that the culture of the natives developed after they arrived in America. Consequently, he was free to speculate about the possible origins of the Indians with geographical limitations imposed by Acosta. There were some people, Herrera noted, who said that Greenland and Scotland were connected. If that were so, then people from Norway or Lapland could have come to America by almost all land route. Evidence that this contact was probable could be found in certain customs common to Laplanders, Norwegians, Escotilanders. All of these peoples lived in forests, caves, or hollow trees. All clothed themselves in skins. All ate fish and wild fruit, and they differed a little in color. Other men, he concluded, lived in Tierra de Fuego to be part of the great Antarctic continent, which connected with the East Indies. If they were so, migrants could come that way with small canoes or balsas, and without need of compass. Evidence that this route might have been used lay in the common color of the natives of East and West Indies. Herrera did not think that there was any evidence indicating that the Indian might have descended from the more civilized parts of Europe. Anyway, he wrote, the Indians most probably came to America because of the nearness of the land, and they expanded little by little. The engineer Enrico Martin is probably best known for his work draining the Valley of Mexico. He added the new element in the debate on Indian origins in his Repertorio de los Templos y Historia Natural de Nueva España. Martin did not refer to Acosta by name, but his book reveals an adherence to the type of approach expounded by the old Jesuit. The old world, he said, was easily filled up because it was all geographically contiguous. The New World posed a problem primarily because it seemed to be surrounded by broad oceans. Nevertheless, Martin thought the new settlers must surely have come to the Indies by land. The lack of the art of navigation in ancient times and the inability of men and animals to come by air forced the conclusion on him. Martin suggested that a likely route from the earliest migration would cross from Asia to America in the region of Anon, a place variously located in the extreme northeastern Siberia and northwestern America. Martin did not think the supposed Strait of Anon, which many thought separated northeastern Asia from America, would be wide enough to impede either man or beast. In his younger days, Enrico Martin had traveled briefly to Kurland, modern Estonia. He testified that the inhabitants of Kurland were people from the same tranza, color, condición y brío as the Indians of New Spain. He noted, however, that the Kurlanders were more corpulent than the Indians. He also noted that the people of Kurland differed from their neighbors in both language and color, and he concluded that the Kurlanders and Indians seemed to him to be the same peoples. Martin did not argue that the Indians were from Kurland, but that they were the same type of people as the Kurlanders. He may have thought that the Indians migrated to America from Kurland by way of the Strait of Anon, but if so, he did not make it clear. By the same token, he may have had some concept of a common origin for the Indians and the Kurlanders, perhaps in Syria. His statement concerning the racial and linguistic isolation of the Kurlanders indicates that he probably did have such an idea in mind. Martin, however, did not make the idea explicit. The geographical and the feudal considerations introduced into the debate by Acosta and the skepticism which he expressed concerning the value of the cultural comparison techniques had such a great impact on later writers who considered the origins of the American Indians that this writer has distinguished an Acostan tradition. The Acostan influence was explicit in the work of Aneo Olivia and Antonio de Herrera. It was also apparent in Martin's Reportario. Mendieta likewise expressed sentiments in keeping with the Acostan tradition, but he may not have known Acosta's book. Acosta was not the first of the restrained commentators. Las Casas, Landa, Romani, Zamora, and Shogun were similarly reluctant to commit themselves to the point of Indian origins. But Acosta was the first to put all the elements producing restraint to a well thought out argument which objectively exposed all the considerations necessary to a solution to the problem of American origins. For that reason, it seemed appropriate that the scientific theme bear his name. Take it with a grain of salt. There are other theories that make more sense to me.